Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics relating to intentional whole child development and supporting the critical work of parents and teachers of young children. Why are there so many reports of children frequently falling out of their seats? Why is behavior becoming more and more of a challenge in the classroom? And why are delayed fine motor skills becoming more and more prevalent? One common thread, as my guest Ray Pica will explain, is movement. In Ray's new book, Acting Out, she addresses not only why a lack of movement is causing serious problems for our youngest learners, but also how we can get more movement into the classroom and what kind of payoff will result. Ray has been an advocate for movement and for developmentally appropriate practice for almost 4 decades now and has a wealth of experience to share. You can find show notes for this episode at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 29. Inspired by this hot topic, there will be a new letter in the Why We Play collection popping up soon for all of you who have purchased the full collection. If you'd like to own this letter too and want to share the importance of play with those around you, make sure that you hop over to notjustcute.com/whyweplay to download a free sample letter and get the conversation started. Okay, Ray has some fascinating observations to share, so let's jump in. Hi, Ray. It's always exciting to have you here.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for having me.
We have talked before, and we've talked off the podcast as well, and we've made mention that if we said all the things that we want to say with each other, this would be a very long podcast. I know you and I share a lot of similar opinions.
Yes, we do, about movement, about child development, all the important stuff.
Yeah. So we're trying to stay very focused today, and I know you have you have a career full of work on helping children and particularly focusing on the importance of movement with children. And I'm curious, over those decades of working with early childhood education and working not exclusively, but with a great emphasis with movement, I'm curious, over those decades, what kinds of changes that you've seen in regards to the movement that children get and the movement that they are allowed to get over that span of time?
Yeah, there have been a lot of changes, and I guess next year it'll be 4 decades, so yikes.
Oh my goodness. Congratulations.
Well, thank you. I've got all the white hair to prove it. So, yeah, I mean, it seems to come in cycles, but when I first started, if I mentioned the words children and movement in the same sentence, teachers had a tendency to back away from me because I didn't want to hear those 2 words in the same sentence. They just had, an automatic vision of children bouncing off the walls. And after that, thanks to the efforts, a lot in part to National Association for the Education of Young Children, NAYC, and those of us who are out there beating the bushes, teachers came to understand the value of movement, and so I got less resistance to it. And then over the last, I don't know, what's it been, Amanda, the last couple of decades, there's been this emphasis on academics and accountability that is just insane and making movement nearly extinct. And so the children aren't having the opportunity to play outside of the classroom, and they're not getting the opportunity to move in the way they used to in an early childhood classroom. And what's interesting is that maybe it's just that I've been around forever and a day, but it seems like my work is more popular than ever because now that the children aren't having the chance to move, teachers are really seeing the value of it. And unfortunately, they're being told by administrators and policymakers, too bad, so sad. So, there have been changes.
Yeah, I think that ebb and flow, that cyclical nature that you mentioned is always so fascinating. It's always so intriguing. And I'm curious your thoughts on that when it swings that direction or when specific people hold this belief. There's often, and I've had several questions from people recently on this as well, there's often this line of thinking that learning looks like children sitting still, right? That there's kind of this premium that's been put on getting kids to sit still and listen and putting those things together. Why do you think that there's so much emphasis on that, on getting kids to sit still and this kind of this bonding between sitting still and learning?
One of my least favorite phrases or sentences in the world is it's always been done this way. When we think back to those old photos, those black and white photos of children seating so primly in rows, and the teacher as the sage on the stage, or whatever it is they say. We associate learning with sitting still and listening, but we know that the more senses we use in the learning process, the more information we retain. And so sitting and listening isn't really giving children optimal opportunity for learning. The belief is just that sitting equals learning. It is also about control, but the research shows us that sitting increases fatigue and reduces concentration. So if we pay attention to what we know about, the research about sitting and child development, then we know it's wrong-headed to try to make them sit to learn.
And I love that you bring that up. I'm so passionate about making sure that what we're doing in homes and in classrooms matches up with what we know from research and studies. And so often, and I say that to people, we want to make sure that what we do matches up with what we know. And people kind of look at you like, well, of course, that's obvious. That's what we would do. But so often those are at odds with each other. And it's really important to get that message out. You touched on something there that I think is really important. I think a lot of people maybe avoid movement, especially in the classroom, because they're worried about losing control, that they think, well, that sounds great, but it also sounds like chaos, right?
Yeah.
So how do you think that parents and teachers in their, various settings, how can they better incorporate movement without creating mayhem, or how would you address this concern or this fear that a lot of people have?
Well, I think that if we, again, understand children and child development, we will use movement to avoid mayhem. After all, children were created to move, and why movement is so often seen as misbehavior, I do not know. And when we restrict them from doing the things that they're meant to do, frustration is the ultimate result. And when they get frustrated, they don't have the language to explain or express what they're feeling. They just act out. So, we need to let them move. We need to use their need for movement. In my new book, Acting Out, I use games like statues for teaching self-regulation. So, we have two choices here, as the way I look at it. We can either ask the children to sit still, sit still, sit still, which they're not capable of doing, or we can use what we understand about children and have them play a game like statues, where they freeze into a statue when the music stops, and that teaches them how to be still. And they want to be still because they want to be statues. It's fun. And that's where children's intrinsic motivation comes from. In terms of, better incorporating movement without creating mayhem, if we come at it again from the perspective of the child with an understanding and a respect for the wonderful stage that they're at, we won't do things like hand them equipment and expect them to stand absolutely still and wait further instructions with bated breath. That's just not what a little one is going to do. They're excitable and they're intrigued and they're playful and inquisitive. So if we give them just a little bit of time to experiment with the equipment, then they'll be ready to listen to our instructions. So if we keep those things in mind, also, that's not to say there shouldn't be some basic ground rules around movement. And to me, the primary one is we will respect one another's personal space. So, how do we teach them about personal space? We don't tell them. We let them experience it. We let them stand inside of a hoop or on a carpet square and reach high and low and wide and forward and backward and see just how much of the area around them makes up their personal space. They can pick up those hoops, hold them around the waist, or if you don't have them, put your arms out to the side and move around the classroom without touching anyone else's hoops or hands. And then the children understand that they take their personal space with them. So you do a lot of personal space activities so that they begin to understand that. Common sense things like using your voice as a tool. If you want them to move slowly, you speak slowly. If you want them to move quietly, you speak quietly. So it's just coming at it from the perspective of a child. I know that was a very long answer.
It was fantastic, though. And I love, you started and ended at the same place. I love what you pointed out about taking the perspective of a child, that when you come to an activity, whether it's specifically a movement activity or otherwise, if you take that time to say, what would a child do here? What would their impulse be to do for movement here? And how can I incorporate that? So instead of, here's this activity and I haven't put any thought about movement into it, and then I'm going to be frustrated because they will want to move. Instead, if I proactively take the perspective of the child and think, if I hand them these materials, or if we do this type of an activity, what kind of movement would they be likely to do? And how can I organize and plan for that so that it's, has the structure that makes me feel comfortable and has the movement that helps them to feel alive, right? And to feel comfortable as well.
Exactly. You might have want to do a partner activity and you've asked the children to pair off, and it's not unusual for the last two children, for one of them to look at the other and say, I don't want to be your partner. And the teacher has two choices. You can accept that this is typical childlike behavior and move on with the activity, just ignore them. And when they see the rest of the children going forward with the game, they will join in. Or you can take time away from the children who do want to participate by debating with the children who don't, so yeah, you really have to look at things from the perspective of a child.
Yeah. And it sounds so simple, but it can make all the difference in your planning, your preparation, and the way that you implement it as well.
It can. I mean, when we think about transitions, when I do that particular training, I ask them to think about words that, they would typically associate with transitions, and it's chaotic and frustrating and all this. And then I ask them to think about a couple of things that, not cognitively speaking, or academically, what are a couple of things preschoolers are not yet developmentally ready to do? And the top of the list are being quiet and staying still. And those are the two primary things we ask them to do for transitions. So, I'm seeing a little disconnect there.
Right. Well, and you hit on something earlier that got me thinking. You were giving examples of activities, and you were talking about, movement and activity games that teach self-regulation and that teach personal space and those types of things. And as you were talking, I started thinking, I wonder if the fact that so much of these types of activities and movement in a lot of places are being pushed out of the classroom. We don't have time for those things because we want to sit and do worksheets. And then we're hearing about so many children who are struggling with self-regulation. They're struggling with personal space. They're struggling with behavior issues. It kind of becomes a cyclical thing because you hear from teachers that I have so many behavior issues in my classroom, we can't do movement. And then you also see the flip side of that we're not doing movement. We just kind of expect kids to come with those skills ready-made. When they get pushed out, those skills get pushed out because we don't have time for play. We don't have time for movement. And then we just expect them to have those skills that those activities would develop. And we become frustrated that they don't. And we begin to blame the children for not having social skills, for not having self-regulation, for having these behavior problems, rather than moving back to the source and focusing on giving them experiences and movement and play that will help to build those skills. And maybe in that, I was moving to this next question, and maybe you've already answered it with that, but I guess in the long term and the short term, when children don't get enough movement, what are some of those consequences of not getting enough movement? I mean, I guess that's one that you just pointed out, when that we can use those activities to teach social skills and self-regulation. So obviously, if you don't have time for those, you don't have that movement, you're going to see that lack, which we are seeing. But are there others that we overlook?
Yeah, no, there are so many consequences. And one for sure is that early childhood professionals are seeing far more challenging behaviors than they used to. I hear it all the time. And some of them associate it with the lack of movement and the lack of play in the children's lives. And some of them don't get it. Well, they're going to have to learn to sit still. So we have to teach them to sit still by making them sit still. No, that is not what Mother Nature intended. There's a whole process in place that involves first moving. So just to look at three consequences. I mean, one that I came across not too long ago, it just shocked me. It makes me almost speechless. I read about children falling out of their chairs in schools. Have you heard that, Amanda?
Right. Yeah, I've heard reference to those. Yeah.
I mean, so one first grade teacher counted. I mean, this is, you'd think, oh yeah, well, that doesn't happen very often. That's just a one-off. But one first grade teacher counted how often it happened, and in a week, it happened 40 times that children fell out of their chairs. Now, this is appalling. This is not supposed to be happening. Why is it happening? Because children are getting so little movement that their proprioceptive and vestibular systems are not being developed the way they're supposed to. And, it takes movement to develop those systems. So they have no idea where their bodies are in space, and they have no balance. So plop, off they go. It's, I immediately wrote a blog post about it because I was so appalled, called Making a Mess of Human Development, something about the terrible consequences of our choices for children. I mean, I find it horrifying. Okay, so number two, I hear this from teachers all around the country. The children have no fine motor skills anymore. And it's not just that they can't hold a pencil correctly. I mean, they're not supposed to for a little while anyway, but they can't tear a piece of paper. I mean, they can't take the wrapper off of a straw. What is going on here? Well, most people don't understand that motor development occurs from the top of the body to the bottom, from the inside, the trunk to the extremities, the outside, and from the large muscles to the small muscles. So again, there's a process that nature has put in place. They have to be able to, master those big body skills, those large muscle skills, before their fingers are going to work properly. And so they're not getting enough movement. I mean, I've heard a lot of people say the best way to teach children to learn to write is to let them, swing on the monkey bars and climb trees. And who would associate such things with writing? But again, you develop the large muscles first and the small muscles will follow. That's not to say that they shouldn't be doing things like playing with, scissors and Play-Doh and clay and all of those, drawing and coloring, all of those things at the same time, which also have gone by the wayside. So we've got children falling out of chairs. We've got no fine motor skills. And, you can't ignore the health issues. I know that the term childhood obesity has been said so many times that we really don't even hear it anymore. But we have a health crisis for children in this country and actually, around the world. It's happening. And it's not just, children who are overweight who need physical activity. It's all children. Again, it's what Mother Nature intended. Another story that I hear all the time is, we were going to go for a walk with the children. They got halfway down the block and they were exhausted. No, that is not supposed to be happening. In the past, I would watch children run up this big hill that I had trouble walking up, and that's the way it's supposed to be. They're supposed to have amazing energy and cardiovascular health. And, now we have children 6 to 10 dying of sudden cardiopulmonary arrest, and 40% of 5 to 8-year-olds showing at least one heart disease risk factor. This is also terrifying. So we're just making so many mistakes with children, and I worry so much about their future.
And you've laid it out so well. We should all be worried about that, right? And it makes so much sense that when we don't pay attention to the body, that we're going to see those kinds of consequences. And I love, you have a phrase that you use frequently and I may missay it, so you'll have to correct me, but the education is not just from the neck up. Is that how you say it?
Children don't exist only from the neck up.
Oh, that's even better. That it's not.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to pay attention to the whole child. That we have to pay attention to more than just the neck up. That there's a whole body. And unfortunately, in a lot of situations, again, it seems obvious that they do have more than just their mind, but that we, in some situations, we seem to have forgotten that in the practices that we're.
Yeah, it
we're
goes
holding.
hand in hand with the
Yeah.
myth that sitting equals learning, doesn't it? I mean, that we think that the mind and body are two separate entities and that the functions of the brain are far superior to the functions of the body without realizing that the two go hand in hand. And the research just keeps coming. You know, every time I see a report, study shows that physical activity improves learning, I say, duh. I mean, it's not news, but I can't complain because the more we hear it, maybe the more we'll begin to believe it,
Bring about
as
awareness.
As George Graham said in his book, Teaching Children Physical Education, we can't just bust their heads to school.
Right. Well,
I don't know why we want to.
Right. And you've laid out, like I said, so many reasons that we need movement, but I know your new book particularly focuses on the behavior aspect and the connection between movement and behavior. And I wondered if you wanted to speak a little bit more about that concept and also about the book itself.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's called Acting Out, Avoid Behavior Challenges with Active Learning Games and Activities. And, I never really associated my work with quote unquote behavior management before, but as I've been hearing these stories, about the children displaying more challenging behaviors and the teacher's frustration and going hand in hand with the children sitting still, it began to occur to me that there is definitely a link there. So, as I said, they are created to move. And when we ignore that, we're just asking for trouble. We just can't avoid it. We can't ignore it and imagine that it's going to go away. So, I use the example of statues. I mean, rather than saying sit still, or just asking them to learn how to stay still, we teach them with something that they love. We think about, again, from the perspective of the child, crisscross applesauce. Let's sit with our legs crossed, our hands in our lap, and our back straight for, 20, 30 minutes while we do story time. I don't know about you, Amanda, but I would last about 12 seconds before I needed to move, and I'm not 4 years old. So, we're asking them to do things that are contrary. So I give alternatives to these traditions, I guess you would say. And then I offer, there's circle games in there for community building. I mean, think about it. If we're all participating in a circle in which we all have a role to play, a responsibility, then it creates that sense of community. If we play cooperative games, we know that cooperative games can foster pro-social skills, whereas competition promotes antisocial behaviors. So we don't want to have them competing. We want to teach them how to work together, how good it feels to be together. And then we have friendlier feelings in our setting. Brain breaks. If we allow them to move every once in a while, I mean, I know that there are teachers out there in situations where the administrators, have a fit if they show up in the classroom and the children are moving. But if we can sneak it in, if we must sneak it in, then give them brain breaks where, they get up once in a while and tiptoe around the room or gallop around the room or just stand by their seats and do a bending and stretching exercise or, anything that gets the mind and the body going and focused. And with all of these things, if we have the research to explain why we're doing them, we're going to be a lot better off. Mm-hmm. Like if we're using active learning techniques. I mean, children are active, experiential learners. So, which means they need to physically experience concepts to really understand them. It goes back to using more senses in the learning process. So if they're getting high and low. They're understanding those mathematics quantitative concepts. And if you can explain that to an administrator and also preferably point to the standard that you're working on, then hopefully you'll get more support for it. And then the book also includes relaxation exercises, because relaxation is a learned skill. You know, as you said, we just sort of expect them to have these skills like it's magic or something. But if we help them learn to take control of their bodies and their emotions by pretending, I don't know, if you're on the way to nap time and you're going to your mat or your cot, I mean, you could just walk there, or you could pretend to be moving through peanut butter, or as though in a film that's been slowed down to slow motion. And that helps the children want to do these things. So, yes, I'm going on and on now, and you should really maybe stop.
No, you're fantastic. You can really tell the passion that you have, and I love that. I love that about you. And as you're talking, when you gave the example of a child sitting crisscross applesauce perfectly straight back for 30 minutes, and I thought back to one of my most, I think, poignant realizations of how important it was for children to move was during one of my elementary education classes at the university, but it was not the intention of the class I was having to teach me about movement, but that's what happened. We had this this long block, and I can't remember why, but it was like a series of, maybe it was just my scheduling or whether it was the way that the program was structured, but I had these back-to-back classes, so I literally had like 3 hours in the same classroom sitting in this desk. And I just remember at one point feeling this overwhelming impulse, like I want to hit my head on this table and I want to jump up and yell and run around this room. And it hit me.
And you weren't 4 either.
Right. And I was an adult, but it hit me, and I thought, this is what kids are doing when they get up and run around the room. Sometimes it just means I have been sitting here way too long, and everything in my body that I've been trying to tell be quiet and sit still for me, it was 3 hours. But for a child, you scale that down. That could be a matter of minutes, and they just need to move, right?
Exactly. I mean, if they're standing, if they're walking around the circle, if they're lying on their tummies, or changing positions, it doesn't mean they're not listening. It doesn't mean they're not paying attention to you. So the book includes research about sitting, lots of research coming out about fidgeting and how children need to move in order to concentrate. All of these things that we need to understand in order to accept that movement is not misbehavior.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love it. And I just so appreciate your passion and your devotion to the well-being of children. You're just such a champion for young children. So thank you.
Oh, back at you, Amanda. Thank you.
Before we go, I know you mentioned that you put together a few PDFs as a resource for people. So I'll link in the show notes. They can find your book as well, but I'll also share this link. I wanted to share a little bit about what it is, these free resources that you're offering.
Yeah, it's the PDFs with the slides and the scripts from 3 of my YouTube videos. But so it's 3 free PDFs. Say that 3 times fast.
I was going to say, I don't know why it's so hard to say.
Also offering games that teach self-regulation, some circle games for building community, and some brain breaks. And they are free to your listeners who go to 𝐅𝐫𝐞𝐞, RAEPICA.com/promo, PROMO. So go there and you'll be able to get those 3 downloads.
Oh, that is fantastic. Thank you so much, Ray, for being here today and just for all the work that you do for young children and for their teachers and their families. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda.
Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 29. You'll also find links to Ray's book, her free downloads, along with other interesting tidbits addressed in this episode. There will also be a link to the Why We Play letter so that you can check out and download the free sample letter. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com. And follow me on Facebook. That's facebook.com/notjustcute. Thanks for listening today, and thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.